Good morning, and welcome to the second reading on the Journeying Through Advent with Handel's Messiah series, entitled Alleluia by Dave and Sally Gobbett. Today, 1st of December, we're in the section part 1, The Promise of the Messiah, and today we're looking at the tenor solo, which is the text based on Isaiah 40, which is the text Isaiah 40, 1-3, where it is, comfort ye, my people, saith your God. Speak ye comfortably to Jerusalem, and cry unto her, that her warfare is accomplished, that her iniquity is pardoned. The voice of him that crieth in the wilderness, prepare ye the way of the Lord, make straight in the desert a highway for our God. The very first words that break the silence come from a lonely tenor. Comfort ye, my people, saith your God. He sings. Taken from Isaiah chapter 40, like several of the early pieces in Messiah, they parachute us into 8th century BC turmoil. After years of spiritual compromise and divine warning, God's people have been trafficked into exile over 500 miles away from home. For these refugees in Babylon, Solomon's temple is a distant memory, as are the sacrifices that took place there, as is the forgiveness that they secured. In their place, it's all warfare. And that's the King James Version's way of referring to Israel's national strife, then the original Israel, that is. And iniquity, that's referring to their spiritual bankruptcy. No doubt, internal voices of guilt and shame would have crowded in. Feelings of regret and loss, confusion and fear. Why have we brought this on ourselves? Is it the end of the road spiritually? Can anything be done about our plight? Has God forgotten us? Is there any way home to a land of spiritual vitality again? Of course, we live in a very different time and place. But some of these questions may have a contemporary ring about them, perhaps even a personal one. For those with ears to hear, the promise of comfort is given 3 times over. The tenor voice triple underlines that God has not forgotten his people. Their long and wearying era of strife and sin is finally over, soon to be firmly in the rearview mirror. And rather than forever rubbing their noses in the past, God is ready and willing to move on. To the future we go. This is comfort indeed. As we look back on the last year, maybe we too have felt somewhat distant from God, if we're honest. Happier times of closeness to God and spiritual vitality seem a distant memory. I've read that slightly different, that passage. I'm going to read it as it is printed. As you look back on the last year, maybe you too have felt somewhat distant from God, if you're honest. Happier times of closeness to God and spiritual vitality seem a distant memory. Perhaps it's because of choices you've made, or the choices of those around you. Perhaps it's just the weariness of trying to live for God when everything around you urges the opposite. But God doesn't want us languishing in spiritual exile. He loves his people too much to leave them struggling alone. Which is why, if you listen closely, you'll hear a voice that crieth in the wilderness, prepare ye the way of the Lord. These words famously belong to John the Baptist, and assure us that whoever we are, whatever we've done, and however hard life has become, this Christmas our Lord is near. With the Messiah, help is never far away. And tomorrow, God willing, we look at the very next verse, which is a tenor aria. Every valley shall be exalted, and every mountain and hill made low, the crooked straight, and the rough places plain. Now, that would be, that for me, that would be a ridiculously short video. So, what I'm doing, I'm enlarging the videos by doing a story of carols. And we're looking at the second part of Paul Gallico's story of Silent Night. Now, yesterday, the 30th of November, I read the first 13 pages. Today I'm going to read the end of page 13 up to about the middle of page 26. So, I hope my voice holds out. He had found the key now to the composition, the simplicity needed to match the words. No complicated harmonies or exalted effects were called for, but only the unadorned melodic line to bring to the minds of the listeners something of the mood of that December eve in Bethlehem in the long ago. Soon a sheet of paper was covered with a rough score. Gruber played the notes and sang them to himself, then took his guitar from the wall and transcribed the accompaniment. It was all done swiftly and easily, since what musician worthy of the name was not capable of putting together a plain, homespun cradle song? Gathering up his papers and slinging his guitar over his shoulder, Gruber set forth on the return journey to Obendorf, hoping that Moore would think he had done the right thing with his unpretentious setting to the poem. "What, back so soon, Franz?" Moore said, amazed, for noon had hardly struck, and the priest was just about to sit down to his lunch. He invited Gruber to join him, and over a bowl of hot soup, the two men studied the notes. Moore nodding and humming. Gruber was as modest about his music as his friend had been about the words. "You will see how it struck me," he said. "Perhaps I haven't done justice to your poetry, but we will try it out when we have finished eating, and see whether you like it." No, Moore assured him hastily. "You have surprised me. Your melody is far superior. After all, my idea was only to help us over our difficulties." An hour or so later, the two men were contemplating one another, and the hastily written score with the satisfaction that comes to creators of any calibre when endeavour has managed to work out fairly smoothly. The blending of their two voices to the guitar pleased them. If the refrain, chorused by the children, came out as well, the music for that part of the service, following the reading of the Christmas story as told by St. Luke in chapter 2, verses 1 to 14 of the Gospels, would be adequate. And adequate was how they thought of it. That afternoon, there were collected in the priest's study, beneath the wreaths and garlands of evergreen, 6 little boys and 6 girls, scrubbed and shining in their warm woolens, jackets and pinafores. They had been selected as the most talented of the children's choir of St. Nicholas, and the most likely to learn quickly, for now there was not much time left. And once more the character of the happy or gay young priest who had summoned them became apparent when the girls appeared with red and green ribbons braided through their plaits, and the boys wore them in the shape of rosettes at their stockings. Moore had supplied streamers of the same colours to be attached to Gruber's guitar. The school teacher composer's thoughts must have been along the lines of, well, in for a penny, in for a pound, for he only smiled and picked up his guitar, which had suddenly become more Italianate than Austrian, and after he and the priest had sung a verse, they rehearsed the children. So now, Hannes, Äffchen, and Petterli, you sing like this, ta-ta, ta-ta-ta-ta-ta, if that's right. And you, Gretel, Liesel, and Johann sing da-dee, da-dee-da, da-da. I think, if I'm right, I'm right. Michael, Lotte, and Maria, here is your part. And Gruber handed them the counterpoint. Franzel, Sepp, and Inge, yours goes just the opposite. First we'll try each group singing separately. Very good. Now we will put them all together. Ready then? And remember, I want to hear the girls at the end of the first line. Also dann. 1, 2, 3. The voices of the children blended. Schreiber in himmlischer Ruhe, Schreiber in himmlischer Ruhe. Something like that. The two men glanced at one another again with satisfaction. A little rough, a bit of trouble with the third bar of the repeat, but easily remembered. Easily remedied, sorry. The silent organ and the rip in the frayed bellows were no longer important. Two journeyman workers, a minor poet and a minor musician, in a few brief hours had managed to arrange a passable substitute. Christmas Eve in Austria of 1818 was very different from the holiday celebrated in the West today. It was then a serious and devout religious festival, solemnized far more in the churches even than in the homes. The family-made crèche, with its carved or waxen figures of the Holy Family, was more important than the Christmas tree. The Christmas tree was only introduced to England, Great Britain, by Prince Albert, the husband of Queen Victoria. And that was in the, 1840s, I think. Prayer, reading of the Gospel, and the sacred music were at the heart of the ceremony. True, there were also gifts and feasting, and the children would already have been scared out of their wits by the appearance of St. Nicholas, accompanied by his assistant known as the Grampus, who seemed to know all about their sins. But the climax was the midnight mass. That night it was cold and fine. There was a crust on the snow, and underfoot it was so dry that it crunched and squeaked beneath the heavy boots of the churchgoers wending their way to the service at St. Nicholas. Their cheery Grüß Gott's, as they met and joined up with one another, rang through the stillness. The air was sharp and crystal clear and crackled in the nostrils. The stars seemed to hang from the sky, and one of particular brightness, if you looked in just the right way, appeared to be shining as though attached to the top of the tallest pine near the church. Successive families, as they passed, would look up and then point it out to those who followed. Once more the bells pealed forth from the tall whitewashed steeple. Within, hundreds of tapers and candles reflected from the gilded and silvered plates and chalices, the brightly painted figures of saints and virgins, softening the faces of the stiff, Gothic wooden Madonnas and haloed figures, endowing them with gentle grace. Angels, cherubim and seraphim, and all the holy ones of the Catholic calendar of saints were decorated with pine boughs and holly berries. Ordinarily, Gruber would have been at the organ, softly playing in the congregation to the strains of old hymns. Now the worshippers were aware of the unusual silence as they entered, and heard the shuffle of their own feet on the stone floor. But word had got around very quickly of the catastrophe, and there was much buzz of conversation and wonderment as to what was to replace it. True, the choir might sing a cappella, but, well, that wasn't real Christmas Eve music. The people packed themselves close on the hard benches, the men in their sombre, lumpy best clothes, the women with gay aprons over their dark skirts, coloured shawls about their shoulders and bright scarves on their heads. The rough rivermen, in the inland sailors' garb of the times of red and blue, occupied the rear pews. The smoke of incense drifted upwards to the roof of the nave. The coffins and scrapings ceased as old Father Nostler, as solid and grim in his robes as the figures carved by peasants out of wood, began the conduct of the Mass. Where the organ should have played its part, the choir chanted from its loft. Yet those in the church felt how much the music was missing. It was like meat without salt. Only a few noticed that the assistant priest Joseph Mohr was nowhere to be seen. Father Nostler read the appropriate epistle to Titus 2 and the lines from St. Luke chapter 2 verses 1 to 14. From the pulpit, the priest had spoken feelingly enough of the miracle of the birth that had taken place some 1800 years ago, its meaning to mankind, and the hopes that it had brought to all the miserable and enslaved of the world. When he finished, the slap made by the closing of the great Bible echoed through the silent church, as though it had been a signal, as indeed it was. For this was the place where he had been told the children would appear and sing. However, he was not prepared for the surprise, as Joseph Mohr, Franz Gruber, and the 12 youngsters, the organist with his guitar slung from his shoulder, marched in from the vestry and ranged themselves before the altar. When the crusty old priest saw the manner in which all were decked out, his face was almost apoplectic, and he raised his hand as though to bring proceedings to a halt. But it was too late, for Mohr had already stepped forward and was saying in effect, "Do you all know that through the accident to our organ, which happened only last night, we have been denied our usual music? However, Herr Gruber and I have prepared a little Christmas song, which we hope will take its place." There was a momentary rustle of astonishment and excitement. In the rear pews, the rivermen grinned and nudged one another as though to say, "Good old Mohr, trust him to come up with something." Then, as Gruber shifted his instrument into position, silence fell once more. He plucked the first chord from the strings of the guitar, and the tenor and baritone voices of the priest and the schoolteacher filled the church, harmonizing as they sang in slow tempo the sweetly lulling melody of the opening words, "Stille Nacht, Heilige Nacht," or "Stille Nacht, Heilige Nacht," something like that. The fresh young voices of the children picked up and twice repeated the refrain, "Schläfer in himmlischer Ruhe." The light, childish soprano of the girls first saw into the roof beams, the second time pronouncing it as softly as a benediction. Verse followed verse, chorus after chorus, and when the last line was sung, "Jesus the Saviour is here," there was heard a long drawn-out sigh and a murmur of satisfaction. There was not a member of the congregation who was not moved by the haunting notes of the refrain. Father Nostler was not amused. Frowning and muttering to himself, and not even deigning to look at his assistant, he took over the altar to complete the rites of communion, and then his fury, unappeased at what he considered a sacrilege in content and execution, he retired to his quarters to pen yet another outraged letter to the Bishop of Salzburg. Gruber and Mohr, however, stationed themselves outside the door of St. Nicholas to greet the emerging Obendorfers. The reactions were mixed. The wife of a select man guessed, "It was a lovely service, Father, but we did miss our music, didn't we?" An elderly woman, tight-lipped, remarked, "Really, Father? It seems to me that church is not the place for playing a guitar." One of the sailors gave the young priest a dig in the ribs. "Not bad, but we could have done with something a bit more lively, eh?" A man complimented Gruber. "That was a nice melody, but haven't I heard it before somewhere?" Another family stopped to say, "Thank you, Father. How pretty the children looked." Where did he hear it before, I wonder? Gruber remained somewhat cynically amused, but on the whole pleased, for the majority of the comments indicated that he had managed to get away with it. He murmured to Moore, "So far so good, but I don't think old Nosler was very pleased. I hope there won't be any trouble." Moore laughed and replied, "Oh, he'll get over it." When the last of the worshippers had dispersed behind the clouds of their own breath in the night air, Gruber wryly held out his hand to his friend and said, "Merry Christmas, Joseph." Or, what's that in German? Frohe Weihnachten? The intonation was not lost upon the priest, who grinned back at him impishly. "The same to you, Franzel." The two men shook hands, and Gruber set off for Arnsdorf and home once more, still smiling gently beneath the muffler now wound about his face to the eyes. A few days later, as the townspeople began to look ahead to the coming new year and what it might hold for them, the incident and the song to which it had given rise were totally forgotten. The verdict of time upon manifestations of genius is unpredictable. Works by creators in every field of the arts, who at some moment or other feel that they are inspired and have produced something immortal, languish rejected by critic and public alike. Trifles tossed off to pay a bill, to amuse a child, or even efforts about to be discarded because they seem ordinary or unworthy, often achieve imperishable fame. Franz Gruber was for his day a competent journeyman musician who, when he died, left behind some 90 compositions, mostly of a religious nature, and as modest, unpretentious, and undistinguished as himself. Each time he sat at his spinet, clavichord, or pianoforte during his lifespan, he set out to write the very best music he could. All contained some of the essence of the man, his dreams, his imagination, his hopes for survival. Yet of these major productions, but one mass for mixed chorus and small orchestra is still occasionally heard in Germany today. During his lifetime, he once rose above himself and soared like a lark upon one heavenly and never to be forgotten flight. And when he put together a simple melody, he was wholly unaware that he had created anything in the least remarkable. On the contrary, when some 36 years later Gruber was asked for his account of how the song came into being, he wrote in his own hand a few cold, dry-as-dust sentences pertaining to the event. It was on the 24th of December of the year 1818 that the incumbent assistant priest, Father Joseph Mohr of St. Nicholas Church in Oberndorf, handed over a poem to the organist of that church, Franz Gruber, who at the same time was also schoolteacher in Arnsdorf, with the request to write an accompanying melody for 2 solo voices, chorus, with guitar accompaniment. The latter, in accordance with the appropriate request of this holy man, who was himself a musician, handed over his simple composition, and it was performed that Christmas Eve to general approval. Even then, so long after, when it had begun to work its magic and the authorship of Silent Night was being attributed to the world's greatest composers, Gruber was not impressed. He had not even the vanity to use the first person in his meagre narrative, but wrote about the church organist Franz Gruber as though he were observing him coldly from a distance. His only reaction to the universal parroting of his song and its appearance designated as authors unknown in dozens of publications was a grumbling that somebody had tampered with 2 or 3 bars and changed a few notes. His was simply the approach of a professional musician. For the rest, he never deemed it worth bothering about. Thereafter, in that testament, he declares, Mr. Joseph Mohr, who was the author of this poem and many other religious songs, died on the 4th of December, 1848. The worthy vicar of Wagram in Pongau. And this was all he had to say of his collaborator. Of the many other religious songs of Joseph Mohr, not one has remained. The words of Silent Night have been translated into more than 50 European languages alone, not to mention those of the New World, America, Asia and Africa. You have to remember that in 1818, the name United States of America was only 42 years old, and it was still deemed the New World at the time. The priest rather fancied himself as a would-be poet. His friends often teased him and dubbed him Poet Jester, and one suspects that perhaps his efforts on most occasions were more doggerel than posy. Mohr had been embarrassed when he handed the verses to Gruber, and for a reason of which he was probably not even aware. In the creation of those lines, something had happened to him, which never had before, and nor ever would again. They had burst from his heart all in one sudden outflowing like a freshet. Another hand seemed to have taken hold of his pen. Poets often long for inspiration, and then when on rare occasions it manifests itself, are more than likely to be fearful and mistrustful of it. Mohr was afraid that Gruber might laugh at him when he read what he had written, and in all probability what held these two men from the realization of what they had wrought was that each saw it only from his own angle and experience, one as a writer and the other as a composer. Each, unaware, had contributed only half a miracle, and therefore saw the whole as nothing miraculous at all. Would Mohr's verses have survived without Gruber's composition? Would Gruber's melody be remembered had it not been for Mohr's words? And why and how did this seemingly insignificant song survive at all? There is a famous old hymn, the first lines of which are, God moves in a mysterious way, his wonders to perform. I think that's William Cowper. And this would indeed seem to be true of the rescue of Silent Night from the oblivion to which it appeared to be consigned, since its original impact upon the world was no greater or more significant than a single grain of sand in a desert. God seemed to move in a strange and complicated manner to enable this particular little work of liturgical song to live on, to carry its message of love and extraordinary heartache throughout the world. And the first hint was to be found in the closing lines of Gruber's own account. This clue was but a passing reference, and never would have been included in Gruber's hard facts narrative, had it not been, as indicated before, that somebody down through the years had tampered with his composition. His only interest was to set the record straight, which he did with a sheet of music which accompanied his story, and which is the only extant version today in Gruber's own hand. He concluded his statement, as this Christmas song came into the Tyrol by means of a well-known Zillertaler, and which, however, appeared in a song collection in Leipzig, somewhat altered, the author of same has the honour to include herewith a score following the original melody. But who was the well-known Zillertaler? Zillertaler, or something like that. He was a virtuoso, maned like a lion, bearded like Jove himself, a large, lusty and powerful personality. In the town of Fügen, in the Zillertal, under the shadow of a jagged, snow-topped range of Tyrolean Alps, lived the Marauscher dynasty, builders of organs. The Marachers were not only manufacturers and repairers of the most expensive and important musical instruments of the times, but were also musicians. To build an organ properly, to construct the pipes in perfect pitch, you had to be able to play. Before the newly finished product was dispatched to the church for which it was intended, its thunder first rang through the halls of the Fugen factory to the majestic chords of Johann Sebastian Bach, George Friedrich Handel, and Buxtehude. In the year 1819, the travelling Maracha was organist Karl, and in April, when the snows blocking the roads had melted and begun their rush to the sea, and the first purple crocuses confirmed that spring was indeed at hand, he hitched up his team to his wagon. Filling it with his tools, sheets of leather, spare pipes, pedals, stops and wire, he clapped his feathered hat upon his massive head, hung his long curved Austrian pipe from his mouth, and set off upon his rounds of visits to churches that had written to complain of sick or disabled organs. And of course the church of St. Nicola at Obernsdorf was on this list. It was not until the middle of May that Karl Maracha pulled his team to a halt, there to be greeted by the hearty Grüß Gott und Willkommen of Franz Gruber. By then Joseph Mohr was no longer there. Whether finally the fulminations of his enemy, Father Noster, had their effect in Salzburg, or that his luck had run out, is not known. The climate of Oberndorf suited him well, and he would have liked to have remained there, but this was not his pattern, and he was now at one of the 10 insignificant posts he would fill, one after another, before he was finally tucked away for good, and all in the oblivion of the tiny mountain village of Wagrain. Dismounting, Maracha followed Gruber into the organ loft and gave a great snort as he saw the rip in the bellows. He fetched his tools and settled down to patching it, no doubt letting drop a few words of sales talk and the value of installing a new instrument rather than relying upon one that could suddenly let one down, and at the most convenient times. And that is page 26, and God willing tomorrow I shall read the rest of page 26, and we'll read up to page 39 in this interesting story, and then I shall complete the reading for the rest of verse 39, page 39, up to page 53, the end of the book. That will be done Tuesday night, as I have no time Wednesday mornings. So it will actually be dark when we do the video for the 3rd of December, because today is the 1st and tomorrow is the 2nd of December. So until the next time, may God bless you all. Amen.